chlorinate the water that can be carcinogenic. So those are some of the other projects that we have ongoing. So we've got a full plate of projects right now in the region. As most of you all know, Appalachia as a broader region encompasses several states. And then this kind of shows you the outlying counties that are involved in Appalachia that extends from New York all the way down to Mississippi. But if you look at those counties that have significant economic distressment, you can see that Kentucky by far and away has the largest amount of counties in the Appalachia region that are economically distressed and have a lot of challenges associated with them. So what are some of the reasons for that? I think part of that, at least in the last probably decade, has been related to the loss of coal industry, which I know from some of your previous class materials you're kind of already aware of. This just kind of shows some of the major counties in the region that are mining coal and some of the loss in productivity in those counties, which you can see is fairly significant. For example, in Martin County, that I'll talk a little bit about, you've got 76% reduction in production. And as you would expect, that also has a significant impact on the loss of jobs in the region, which has all kinds of cascading effects that I'll try to mention briefly here in just a second. But if we step back and look at the regional area, what are some of the challenges in the 21st century? There are several of these. Some are more county specific, but I think at least in Eastern Kentucky, I think there are two significant developments that have happened over the last 20 years that have had a significant negative impact on the region. One of those, as you're all aware, is the loss of the coal industry. That's kind of been driven by a couple of things, an increased international focus on globalism and other coal markets, and also an increased focus on climate change. Both of those together and also changes in technology are contributing to loss of the coal industry and also employment opportunities. As I alluded, that has several different cascading effects. One of those is a lot of these counties have relied heavily on taxes that are imposed on coal that's taken out of those counties, coal severance tax. And in the past, there's been millions of dollars that have gone back into the region, and a lot of that has helped sustain public infrastructure and services. And so now a lot of that money is no longer available, which has just created a huge economic problem. This has also led to a loss of population. One of the unintended consequences of the loss of the coal industry is historically a lot of health workers in the region have typically been the spouses of people that work in the coal industry. So when you've lost the coal industry, then we've also lost a lot of health workers as a consequence of that, as they've also moved out of the area. This has had significant sociological issues and mental health issues that have helped precipitate sort of the opiate crisis, which is not just restricted to Eastern Kentucky, obviously, but has had a significant impact there. It's also impacted the ability to hire qualified people, for example, in the water industry. In order to hire people to operate the water and wastewater facilities, the potential employees have to pass drug tests, and historically there's been a huge proportion of applicants that are not able to do that, which has significantly reduced the amount of availability of people that can be qualified to take some of those positions. Another ironic reason for some of these problems was actually a consequence of unintended consequences. In 2000, at the time, Governor Paul Patton, passed a huge initiative to try to make sure that everyone in Eastern Kentucky got potable drinking water. And so there was a lot of money spent expanding water lines out into the far reaches of various rural counties. Unfortunately, what actually happened was a lot of these systems were not well designed. They had significant pressure problems, either high pressures or low pressures. This contributed to significant pipe breaks There was also problems because of the size of these systems. They were really built inappropriately, overextended. So you had the occurrence of a lot of disinfectant byproducts that occurred. There was excessive water loss. For example, Martin County currently has about a 70% water loss. So 70% of the water that they're treating and pumping in the system is going away through breaks and other problems. Because they're not being able to recoup that kind of income, that leads to higher water rates. It's sort of a vicious cycle. Then people stop using water, which makes the base for the rate structure less, and it just continues to accelerate water rates to the point that a lot of people can no longer even afford the water. Another problem that occurred, where they spent all this money to extend water lines out into counties, they did not spend a similar amount of money to basically build sewer systems to collect wastewater that was then exacerbated by all this new drinking water that was put out in the system. So this tended to overload septic systems that were in the area. We have a lot of straight pipes in the region, so this then actually exacerbated the stream water pollution with regard to pathogens. So a classic example where good intentions has some negative consequences. So I just mentioned some of the issues with wastewater deficiencies in Eastern Kentucky. So I assume most of y'all are familiar with the term straight pipe. This is where someone hooks up a pipe to their toilet and just runs it to the back of their property into a creek. And so a couple of years ago, or well, about over 10 years ago, the area development districts in the region did some surveys and found there were about 15,000 straight pipes that they were able to identify in the region, and approximately similar number of failing septic systems. That should be the second slide. And this has had significant impact on the stream water quality. If you look at the last little picture, there is a map of Eastern Kentucky. All those red areas are streams that are violating their drinking water standards as a result of fecal coliform or pathogens. And it's likely much worse because those are just the streams that have been sampled. So you can see nearly all those streams basically are impacted in one way or the other. And so there's a significant problem with our stream water quality. Just to illustrate this, I mentioned Letcher County briefly before. This is some sampling that we're involved with in 2006. And the little dots show you where we sampled, and the numbers associated with that. There is the first number is something called a geometric mean value, and the second number is the maximum value that was found at all those different sites. And the water quality standard, the first number should be 200 or less, and the second number should be 400 or less. So we spent a significant amount of sampling actually over a 5-year period. This is just representative of one of those years. And what's striking is that none of the streams in Letcher County were meeting their water quality standard for pathogens. So you had excessive values of coliform bacteria in the streams. To shift to another county that I briefly mentioned, Martin County. This is a county that's been in the national and actually international news over the last couple of years because of the severity of problems with their water distribution system, which is somewhat ironic because this was actually the county that Lyndon Johnson launched the war on poverty in 1964, that some of y'all may be aware of. And so we still continue to have problems in that county. I already alluded to the impact of the coal jobs. This kind of shows you the deterioration of employment in the county. So people are losing jobs. There's not a gainful employment. A lot of people are leaving the county, which just puts more stress on the water system. There's also historically been significant mining in the region. And then another kind of infamous situation in Martin County occurred in 2000 when there was a huge coal slurry impoundment in the south part of the county that broke, and you had massive amounts of sludge that basically contaminated these two rivers, one of which went through Inez, the county seat, and then a couple of the other major cities in Martin County. And you've got a couple of pictures of some of the results of that. So the last thing I want to focus on kind of is more the water distribution system. The red lines here represent pipelines that are distributed throughout the county. So you can see they're extensively distributed. Martin County gets their water from the Tug Fork. They pump the water over to a reservoir, the Curtis Chrome Reservoir. It then flows by gravity into a small water treatment plant where it's treated and then pumped out in the rest of the system. And so the local citizens in the county have had significant concerns about this system for years. Just to enumerate some of the problems associated with the Martin County system, I already talked about they have 70% water loss. There's significant cases where they have incidents of discolored water or water that's tasting strange or smelling. There's significant health concerns. There's been detections of bacteria in the water or the occurrence of disinfectant byproducts. And over the last decade or so, they've had over 113 boil water advisories. Some other challenges for Martin County: it has a 40% poverty rate. Its current unemployment rate is 8.4%, but yet it has one of the highest water bills in Kentucky. And part of the reason for that is the utility has been mismanaged in the past. They managed to get themselves into a $1 million deficit. And so they're trying to basically dig their way out of that. And one of the only ways to do that is to raise the water rates to try to get back to normal. So that's one of the things that they're dealing with. However, there's been a recent study done that concluded that about 45% of the residents in Martin County really cannot afford the water that they're still paying for. This has obviously led to a lot of mistrust in the region. Part of it goes back to the way the EPA responded to the coal slurry spill about 20 years ago. Also the fact that there's been mismanagement identified with utility. And there's also some concerns about the way that EPA tests for these disinfectant byproducts. Because of the size of the county, they typically, and this is part of the EPA regulation, only test for 2 locations across the distribution system, which we could probably scientifically argue is not enough to really capture what's going on in the system. I mentioned this whole issue about affordability. Typically, EPA has identified that if you're paying over about 2.5% of your household income for water, that kind of crosses what they characterize as their affordability issue. You can kind of see the distribution of incomes in Martin County and the fact that you have a huge amount of people in this lower end here that basically are paying in excess of that percent of their income. So that's a huge issue as well. Let me take just a few minutes and give you a little more detail of what are some of the problems with the water system in Martin County. First of all, it was built in 1968, but only for 600 customers. Now it serves over 3,600, so it's kind of under design. And when they expanded all these lines, partly is with regard to Governor Patton's initiative. A lot of these lines were just not basically installed properly. You had some kind of shoddy contractors that installed the pipes. And so as a result, many of these pipes have broken and there's a lot of water loss occurring as a result. Part of the water loss is also caused just by the topography. We have some places in the system that have pressures in excess of 350 PSI, which is quite frankly dangerous. There's also pressure surges that occur that cause these pipes to break. And they're just basically, it's sort of like a proverbial situation where you're trying to bail out a boat that's got multiple holes in it that the water's continuing to rush in. Another problem they've had because of all these breaks, they've had to shut down service at times. And because people are worried about water freezing in their pipes, a lot of times they'll just leave their faucet running. That tends to over drain the pipe system, which then causes the system to have to shut down parts of the system, which obviously is not a good thing. And when some of the systems are shut down, you can have contaminants that can kind of enter into the system through breaks or back siphoning that can occur with pressure issues. Another issue is the loss of adequate disinfection. So the way that they protect the water is when they treat it, they put chlorine in it, which disinfects or kills any bacteria, but that chlorine will only provide a residual disinfectant protection for a while. And with really, really long lines out in the county, eventually the disinfectant basically dissipates and then it goes away, so you don't have any disinfectant left, which can then contribute to the growth of biofilms and other bacteria. Because you had a loss of the population in the area, or people are no longer using the water because of concerns, that then further decreases the amount of water that's moving through the pipes, which again increases the water age, which can again contribute to that. And because you have excessive pipe breaks, you get other materials that get into the pipelines, and so the chlorine actually gets used up interacting with a lot of those compounds as opposed to being left over to disinfect the water. And so again, we have deterioration of the water quality. We also have these excessive disinfectant byproducts, which I'll explain a little bit, but that's also related to the water age issue. And then in the past, the way that they've dealt with these water quality issues is they go out, open a hydrant, and just try to flush the bad water out, which again just wastes water and decreases their amount of supply to give to people. So looking at some of these water quality issues, we currently have a study that is looking to try to interact with the stakeholders. We just recently completed a study where we had 97 different families that allowed us to go in and sample the water in their homes, and then and we also did a survey to kind of assess what people's understandings of or expectations of the water was. These are some of kind of the top reported concerns that people were worried about. 74% of the respondents said they were worried about low water pressure or bad odor or discoloration, or in some cases they were noticing irritation with exposure to the water. So some significant problems. So let me talk briefly about this whole concept of disinfectant byproducts. That may be a new concept to you. In any water system, one of our main concerns is to make sure we don't have an outbreak of bacteria in the water lines, obviously. And typically the way that we try to counteract that is by adding some type of chlorine compound. There's several different alternatives, but if there is organic compounds in the source water, the chlorine can interact with those natural organic compounds, and they can create a whole series of molecules called disinfectant byproducts. And there's 4 classes of those typically that I've listed there, and they've found to be potentially causing health defects or cancers in some cases. And so for most water systems, you're trying to balance these two. So you want to make sure you have adequate chlorine to kill the bacteria, but if you put too much chlorine in, you can kill all the bacteria, but you'll create these disinfectant byproducts. And so for most systems like in Danville or Lexington, you've got good design systems and adequately operated systems that you basically keep this in balance. But a lot of these systems in Eastern Kentucky, because of the size of the systems and the water age problems, it's frequently a problem. You're going to end up on one side or the other. You're either going to have bacteria or you're going to have too many disinfectant byproducts. And so it's a real challenge for these systems to operate with those constraints. So You can be exposed to these disinfectant byproducts either through your skin or through oral or inhalation. And I've briefly mentioned some of the potential health impacts associated with these types of exposures. So this is a real concern, not only with the Martin County system, with a lot of systems in Eastern Kentucky. So as part of that study that I just alluded to, we also did do some testing in the homes for the presence of two of these disinfectant byproducts. And at least for the one on the left here, which this stands for trihalomethanes, you can see we had a significant amount of homes that actually indicated concentrations in excess of the water quality or drinking water standard. Less than for this other compound, acetic acids, but in both cases, the actual regulatory sampling that's done every month for these utilities did not reveal any of these types of problems. Again, part of that is you just got a couple of sites. One of them is down here, and another one is up here. Those are the only two sites that are actually sampled each month. So there's concern that maybe this standard regulatory sampling is not capturing the potential exposure for the citizens in the region. And part of that is, again, exacerbated by the fact the system has 70% water loss and all these other complexities. So one of the things that we're currently doing is we've developed computer models that we can actually model the flow through these systems, and also we can simulate and predict water quality concentrations, whether it's chlorine residuals, water age, and things like that. And so in the current study that we're working on, we're looking to use these models to get a better sense for why we're having these problems and how we can start addressing them. And part of that is the development of a conceptual model. This is a conceptual model of the Martin County system that helps people understand how the system is operating. It's actually a very complicated system because of the mountainous terrain. You have a lot of sections that have to be subdivided into different pressure zones, which further complicates the operation and makes it more difficult to maintain the water quality status. Just one other item that's now an emerging concern is a whole series of compounds called PFAS. There's probably 5,000 of these different molecules that kind of in our whole family. There was an excellent couple of movies out on this topic. One was The Devil We Know, and the other movie was more recently called Dark Waters. It kind of gives you some background. There's been several different plants that DuPont operated, two in particular in North Carolina that caused a lot of contamination, and the one that impacts kind of our region was at near Parkersburg, the DuPont factory there, that was operating through 2015 and was producing these whole series of PFAS compounds that basically they're used in all kinds of products, Teflon, Scotchgard. They're used in packaging for fast food packages. So it's highly likely that you all have some PFAS molecules in your body just because of the systemic exposure to these. In Kentucky, we have done some preliminary testing, at least the Kentucky Division of Water. This shows the sites that have been sampled. These are water utilities to try to see if there are some concentrations in violation of the standards. So this just shows you those where they did detect some PFAS at, as well as others without. And then 3 of these 5,000 compounds, some of the more prominent ones, one is called PFOS. And you can see, fortunately, we only have one site that's above about 10 nanograms per liter. The actual standard is for EPA is 70 nanograms per liter, although there are some states in the Northeast that actually have much lower concentrations, like New Hampshire, New York, and so on. But that kind of shows you the current exposure for that. Here's another one of those. This is Pfoa, a similar compound. And all these compounds have fluorine atoms attached to them, which causes its toxicity. But all these are toxic chemicals that can cause birth defects and or cancers, typically of the urinary tract. And then DuPont tried to come up with kind of a new product called Gen X, which is a different molecule, but it also has been determined it has significant health impacts as well. And so again, you can kind of see some of the exposure there. Again, most of the exposures that we found with are not exposures, but higher concentrations typically are along the Ohio River, which most likely are coming from the residuals from the DuPont plant over in West Virginia. So just a few final thoughts about some of the underlying causes of challenges of water in Eastern Kentucky. I think one of the challenges is a failure of decision makers to really understand, appreciate the local culture and context of their decisions. Sometimes this is just because of arrogance of people towards a region. I think a lot of times it's due to a lack of bidirectional communication, where you actually listen to people and try to understand what their concerns are. In some cases, because of past problems, there's sort of a collective guilt, and instead of trying to actually work to understand the problems of politicians, a lot of times just throw money at the problem. A lot of that money gets mismanaged. And then we've had, I think, ineffective federal interventions in the region for decades. There's typically good intentions, but a lot of the implementation of those lead to unintended consequences, and I've mentioned a few of those. I noticed in some of the questions, it's like, well, why isn't EPA doing a better job enforcing these regulations and so on? And again, it's a little more complicated than you might think. Most of these communities do not have the infrastructure finances to basically keep up with a lot of the additional regulations. And what happens is the federal government mandates things which are well and good, but they don't really provide communities with sufficient resources to implement those types of new regulations. So that's traditionally called an unfunded mandate, and we typically see that a lot in the environmental area and region. So that becomes a problem. Then also, I've just noticed regional inequities over my career, where I think a lot of the East and West Coast historically have kind of exploited Appalachia for energy. And now with a growing interest of climate change, which is obviously a legitimate concern, I just see a lot of people tend to project negativity on Appalachia. And it's like, well, these people are bad because they mine coal and it's created this climate issue, but yet they've been exploiting the region for decades and have not basically put resources together to try to compensate the region for new restrictions and so on to try to make our climate better. That's another whole discussion we can have. There's obviously challenges of the topography in this area. Everything that's done over there with regard to infrastructure is more expensive than other areas. There's also environmental challenges like historic flooding. That's been a big issue. And there's just really a lack of economies of scale because we have very small communities. And so everything, again, it just makes everything very expensive. We can also have histories of ineffective governance, local politics, where you have people that may be in government that divvy out contracts to their relatives or something, and you get then poor infrastructure put in place. And then what we've also seen I think, is a lot of these counties, you'll have a judge executive that the way that they get elected is running on a campaign not to increase your utility rates or your water rates, which just erodes the financial base to keep these systems operating properly. In some counties, we've seen this has gone on for 20 years, and it just creates a disaster, basically. And so that's another whole political issue. I've already kind of mentioned the loss of the coal industry, some of the issues there. There are educational challenges. For example, there's a huge lack of trained operators for a lot of these facilities, and then it's hard to get qualified people. That we run into challenges because of restrictions, for example, for drug testing and so on. This is also just contributed over the years to a lot of social challenges. People can become apathetic because of just seeing how things have happened in the past. And again, I've mentioned some of the technical issues from an engineering standpoint that we've also encountered. So that kind of gives you my kind of quick synopsis of some of the issues related to water equity in Appalachia. It's a very complicated issue. It just seems on the surface like, well, we should be able to fix this. This is, but when you start working in the community and listening to people, you realize things are always more complicated than necessarily you assume. So, but hopefully I've given you some things to think about or discuss, and I guess I can open up for a few questions.
So thank you so much for that informative and engaging presentation, Dr. Ormsbee. So you talk a lot about this issue as a political issue and some of the political context. Looking at the federal context in particular, given the way things shook out in the 2020 elections, and particularly in the Senate, I'm looking at Appalachia having a decent amount of power within the Senate. The individual who will likely be a swing vote for a lot of different things is going to be Senator Joe Manchin of Virginia. Mitch McConnell will continue on as Senate Minority Leader. I believe the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act is up for renewal this year. Do you see any cause for optimism at the federal level, given the current situation and the current configuration that we have in the federal government?
Well, I guess I do have some optimism, but also some cynicism after watching what's happened in the region for decades. There's another representative that you did not mention, which is Hal Rogers, that has a significant influence in the region. As you may have known, he used to be chair of the House Appropriations Committee, which was probably as powerful as the Speaker of the House in some ways historically. He stepped down from that, but he still has some significant influence with regard to Kentucky. Related, as an example, related to the wastewater issue, back around 2000, Hal Rogers was able to secure over $100 million to create a program called Eastern Kentucky Pride that tried to go in and start addressing a lot of these straight pipes and wastewater issues and also solid waste issues. And that was somewhat successful. But again, the problem is just so huge, it's hard to get a handle on that. I guess why I said I have some cynicism where I do expect, for example, the Biden administration, or at least the EPA, to probably start making some advances with regard to increased regulations in the Drinking Water Act. There's some amendments basically pending for that. And also potentially with regard to stream water quality and so on. My concern is that when these regulations are increased or improved, that there has to be some level of funding to try to help this region implement some of those types of standards. It's highly unrealistic to expect the government to tell the region, you've got to improve all these things, but we're not going to give you the money to help do that. And so historically, for example, the water systems, one of the things that I've got some colleagues working with state government that we've been advocating for is to try to have a pool of money that can be set aside that can be used to address some of these crisis systems and go in with new management, external management, to try to get them back on their feet and operating properly. But historically, the finances have kind of been left to the local communities to try to come up with, although there are some state and federal programs that they can apply. But as an example, some of those programs have restrictions that you can't apply for a loan, for example, to fix your water system unless your water loss is under 15%. Well, I mean, that kind of is like a self-defeating criteria, right? If you've got 70% water loss, you can't get loans to fix your system. So how are you ever going to get it down to a 50% level? So those are just a couple of thoughts, I guess, right off the top of my head related to your question, right?
Wonderful. So we'll open it up to any of the students, any of the guests have questions for Dr. Ormsbee. Please use the raise my hand feature on the chat. So Maddie Jenkins has raised her hand.
Yes, Maddie.
Hi there. First of all, thank all three of you guys for coming and like talking to our class and stuff. We're really glad to have you all. And my kind of question was, I was just wondering if you know, do people in Appalachia use like water tank trucks? I know that that's a popular thing in some rural places like outside of Louisville. I know my grandfather has like a concrete cistern like right next to his house where before he was like had a line from city water, he would just have a tank truck come. And I was just wondering if people do or don't use those, if they're ineffective because of the mountains, that kind of thing.
That's a great question, Maddie. And you would think just in a normal like rural county that might be a typical service, right? Or where people have cisterns they can fill up. Somewhat ironically, in this case, because of as I alluded to the PAT initiative, they basically extended potable water to essentially everyone in the county. The problem is people don't trust it, so they don't want to drink it. So as a consequence, a lot of people are buying bottled water, which is highly expensive, obviously, and or some people have actually reverted to getting swimming pools, plastic swimming pools, and catching rainwater and then using that for non-drinking purposes. Or in some cases, they've been able to, those little springs that are coming out of the hillside. Some cases, they've actually had some old mining portals that they have hooked up their own pipe to try to get water out for typically, again, non-potable purposes. But a lot of people are using either bottled water or they're drinking soft drinks or other types of things like that, which kind of gets back to that Mountain Dew point that Remy made. So, so the answer basically to that question is no, they really don't have that type of service because they've got pipes in essence that are bringing water to them, but in many cases they just don't trust it. So they're reverting to other sources. Or in some cases, there's been a significant amount of theft of water as well. So.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
It's a pretty shy group you got here.
Yeah, I guess a lot of them. I see George Mehrhoff raised his hand.
All right, George.
Hi. Thank you again for coming. I just had a question. I took a course on water resources before, and I remember learning a little bit about like the 303D list from the EPA.
Yes.
And I guess it's just a report that on the stream water quality and the contaminants in that area. And I just looked, and Martin County hasn't had a report since 2016. And you mentioned that the EPA, something about some problems with funding in the counties in conjunction with the EPA. I was just a little confused as to why like they aren't getting that data.
That's a great question. So typically when the state does a water quality assessment of their streams, they're only sampling a small fraction of the actual streams. It's typically like maybe 10% or something. And several years ago, in order to try to get a little bit of greater coverage, they divide the state into 5 different regions. And then every 5 years, they will do a more detailed sampling in that river basin, like the Big Sandy, for example. I think as an example, if you look in the 2016 report, they actually did some more focused sampling in the Kentucky River, I believe, and the Big Sandy that year. All right. But again, if you go back and look to the, see if I can bring up that stream map real quick for you. So this down here, you can see all of these counties, like here's Martin County, there's like one little tiny segment that was sampled. That's the only stream that was sampled in the entire county, all right? And so there you can see there's some counties that there's no stream sampled whatsoever. And so these represent the streams that were actually sampled that are highlighted. There's actually, I think, some green ones. This was actually in 2012. So historically, they have been sampling those every year. Or excuse me, they've issued a report every year. But yeah, I was actually checking on the Division of Water's website yesterday. I didn't see anything after 2016. Melissa, you got any comments on that?
Yeah. So that integrated report that assesses all the state's water bodies that the Division of Water has assessed comes out every 2 years. But like Dr. Ormsbee said, they rotate around on their focus basin. And I do think the last one that focused on, this area, so Eastern Kentucky, was in 2016. But due to funding limitations for sampling and staffing limitations, which are pretty severe right now, they can only cover so many streams in the area. But these funding opportunities for like water infrastructure usually don't hinge that much on the outcomes of that report.
Right. Yes, but the 303D report that, was it George that alluded to, basically the state surveys all the streams in the Kentucky, or well, as you can see, it's a very small percentage. And of those streams that are violating their water quality standards, like the red streams, they all get sort of put on a naughty list called the 303D list. And so when they're put on that list, then the state is required by federal law to do a study of that stream and essentially come up with a management plan. But most states are probably decades behind on that process. And again, as Melissa alluded to, the state is just well understaffed to be able to, number one, go out and even sample the streams, or number two, to subsequently develop plans for those. That's one of the reasons why we are fortunate in Kentucky. We have a very active volunteer sampling network that does sample a lot of streams in addition to the ones that the state does. And we maintain a database of all that information and produce an annual report. In fact, Melissa kind of coordinates that activity for the Kentucky River Basin. You want to say anything else about that, Melissa?
No, I was thinking that though, that we promote the citizen science organization to help fill in the gaps of all these streams that the state agencies can't get to. And then we don't have maybe as scientifically as rigorous a protocol, but at least that elevates some of these streams to being recognized by the Division of Water that they need to go follow up, like it flags them. And then we hope that they'll go out and get their own data.
And in some cases, when there are severe watersheds, there's another federal source of funding called the 319 Fund. Again, very little money, but it can be used to go in and develop a management plan for some of these impaired watersheds. And so we just recently, and Melissa, as I alluded to, was one of the PIs on that, just completed a study on 3 watersheds in Letcher County that basically develops a program for how to try to address some of the impairments there. If anyone's interested in those reports, you can either contact me or Melissa. We can get you copies of that. And also some of the sampling reports related to the volunteer sampling.
I did just get off the phone before this with our contacts in Whitesburg and Letcher County about activities that we're going to do to try to implement some of these ideas to help address, like, for instance, water quality issues with the straight pipes. And the lady who's running that program there just wants to start with the basics of environmental literacy, because she said, that's what's so critical is people there don't even understand like the basic, like why these impacts are showing up and what can be done about them. So we're starting at ground level there.
Yes, Lauren?
We have time for, I think, one last question. So Lauren could be our last question.
Okay.
So in regards to a lot of the misdesigned infrastructure going along with the patent initiative, what is the solution to fixing that other than throwing more money into, I guess, updating it and improving it?
That's an excellent question. Unfortunately, part of the solution is going to be that, and I wouldn't say throwing money, but there needs to be I mean, hindsight's 2020, obviously, but some of these systems were just not designed very well. The contracts were probably given to people that weren't quite as qualified. So what we're trying to do through one of our programs is going back and working with all the water utilities. We've worked with, or we've met with about 60 of those thus far. And in many cases, we're trying to build models of their systems so we can then use the computer to do some analyses to try to pinpoint where they have some of these design inefficiencies that might give them some guidance on where to focus. Because in many cases, for example, Martin County, they're just almost on a daily basis sending crews out to repair broken lines that are popping up everywhere. So we think that those are related to different causes that the models can kind of help us have a better understanding of. So that's one thing. We're also trying to train some of these operators and managers how to better operate and manage their systems so they don't get into those types of cases. But part of it is these systems are just very challenging because of the topography and the way the systems are. It's a real challenge. So.
I think we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Ormsbee. You and the rest of the guests are welcome to stay as long as you'd like and sit in on our lecture. I will dismiss Group A. So Group A, I think, is put in 2.5 hours now on Zoom. So I appreciate y'all your attention and your patience with the Zoom lecture. And Group B, I'll have you stick around. So let's thank Dr. Ormsbee and the rest of our guests as well. Again, y'all are welcome to stick around as long as you'd like.